The Wyoming winter of 1887 hit harder than most folks remembered. Thomas McKenna pulled his worn coat tighter as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward his barn, the wind howling like a banshee across the endless plains. At 45, his weathered face told stories of loss and solitude. His wife Sarah and young son had succumbed to fever 3 winters past, leaving him alone with nothing but cattle and memories. "Easy there, Belle," Thomas murmured to his favorite mare as he filled the water trough, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The storm had been raging for 2 days, and he'd already lost count of how many times he'd made this treacherous journey to tend his livestock. As he stepped outside the barn, something caught his eye, a dark shape partially buried in a snowdrift near the fence line. Thomas squinted through the swirling snow. What in tarnation? He grabbed his lantern and pushed through the deep powder, his boots crunching with each labored step. The shape was human, a young Native American man, probably in his 20s, wearing traditional buckskin clothing now soaked through and frozen. His long black hair was matted with ice, and his lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. Thomas knelt beside him, pressing his ear to the man's chest. A faint heartbeat, but barely there. "Lord Almighty," Thomas whispered, "you're barely hanging on, son." Without hesitation, he scooped the unconscious man into his arms. The stranger was lighter than expected, his body dangerously cold. Thomas struggled back to his small wooden cabin, kicking the door open with his boot. Inside, the warmth from his stone fireplace felt like heaven. Thomas laid the man on his own bed, quickly stoking the fire until flames danced high. He'd seen enough frostbite during his years on the frontier to know time was critical. "Sorry about this, but these clothes gotta come off," Thomas muttered, carefully removing the frozen buckskin garments. He wrapped the man in his own wool blankets and began rubbing warmth back into the stranger's hands and feet. For hours, Thomas worked tirelessly, warming broth on the stove, applying hot compresses, never leaving the bedside. The wind continued to rage outside, but inside his humble cabin, he fought a different battle against death. Near midnight, the man's eyelids fluttered. Thomas leaned forward. "Easy there, friend. You're safe now." Dark eyes opened slowly, filled with confusion and wariness. The young man tried to sit up, but Thomas gently pressed him back down. "Don't try to move just yet. You were near frozen solid when I found you. Name's Thomas McKenna. This is my place." The stranger studied Thomas's face carefully, then spoke in accented English. "I am Ayana of the Lakota." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Well, Ayana, you picked a hell of a night to be caught in that storm. What were you doing out there?" Ayana's jaw tightened. "Hunting party. Separated. I became lost when the snow began." Thomas nodded, stirring the pot of beef broth he'd prepared. "Lucky I found you when I did. Another hour and—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Here, try to get some of this down." As Ayana slowly sipped the warm broth, Thomas couldn't help but notice the intricate beadwork on the man's leather pouch, the quality of his silver bracelet. This wasn't just any warrior, he came from people of standing. "Your family, they'll be worried sick about you," Thomas said. Ayana met his gaze. "Why do you help me, your people and mine?" "We are not friends." The question hung heavy in the warm air. Thomas poured himself coffee and settled into his wooden chair. "Maybe not our peoples as a whole, but right now you're just a man who needed help, and I'm a man who could give it. That's enough for me." Something shifted in Ayana's expression, surprise, perhaps respect. "You are different than I expected." "I reckon we all are, once you get past the surface." Thomas stood and added another log to the fire. "Get some rest now. That storm's not letting up anytime soon." Dawn broke gray and cold, but the wind had finally died down. Thomas woke to find Ayana sitting up in bed, examining a crude wooden carving. Thomas had left on the bedside table a small horse he'd whittled during the long, lonely evenings. "You made this?" Ayanna asked, turning the piece over in his hands. "Keeps my hands busy during the winter nights," Thomas replied, embarrassed. "It's not much. It is beautiful. You have skilled hands." Ayanna set the carving down carefully. "I feel much stronger today." Thomas brought over a plate of bacon and eggs. "Good to hear, but you're not going anywhere just yet." "That storm dumped near 3 feet of fresh snow. Besides, you took quite a beating out there." As they ate breakfast together, an unusual companionship began to form. Ayanna told Thomas about his life with the Lakota, how his name meant eternal blossom, in his language given to him because he'd survived a difficult birth when others had not expected him to live. "My grandmother said I was meant for something special," Ayanna said with a slight smile. "Perhaps surviving your blizzard was part of that purpose," Thomas chuckled. "Maybe so. You certainly gave me quite a scare when I found you. And you? You live here alone?" Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "Had a family once, wife and boy. Fever took them both." He stared into his coffee cup. "Then just me and the cattle ever since." Ayanna nodded solemnly. "I understand loneliness. I have not yet chosen a wife, though my father grows impatient. I spend much time hunting, tracking ... away from the village." "What made you become a hunter?" "My father is a respected war chief. He expects much from his only son." Ayanna flexed his injured shoulder. "But sometimes I wonder if there's another path for me." Thomas refilled their coffee cups. "Well, you've got time to figure that out. You're young yet." They spent the morning sharing stories, Thomas describing his journey west from Ohio after the war, Ayanna explaining the Lakota spiritual connection to the land. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they found common ground in their love of horses, their respect for the harsh but beautiful Wyoming landscape, and their shared sense of being somehow apart from their respective communities. By afternoon, Ayanna was strong enough to walk around the cabin. He insisted on helping Thomas with the evening chores, despite the rancher's protests. "I cannot sit idle while you work," Ayanna said firmly. "It is not honorable." Together, they fed the cattle and horses, working in comfortable companionship. Thomas was impressed by Ayanna's natural way with the animals. They seemed to calm at his presence. "You've got a gift," Thomas observed as Ayanna gently coaxed a skittish calf to eat. "All living things understand kindness," Ayanna replied. "Animals, people. We are not so different." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayanna began working on something with materials from his travel pack, thin strips of leather and colorful beads he'd somehow managed to keep safe during his ordeal. "What are you making there?" "A gift. For the man who saved my life." Ayanna's fingers moved with practiced skill, weaving the leather into an intricate pattern. "It is our way." Thomas felt unexpectedly moved. "That's mighty kind of you, but you don't owe me anything." "This is not about debt," Ayanna said quietly. "This is about honor, about recognizing good in another person." As the night deepened, they talked about their different worlds, the changing West, the conflicts between settlers and tribes, their hopes for the future. Thomas found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. "You know," Thomas said as they prepared for sleep, "I never expected to find a friend in all this snow and cold." Ayanna smiled, the first truly open smile Thomas had seen from him. "Nor did I, but perhaps the Great Spirit works in mysterious ways." "Perhaps he does," Thomas agreed, settling into his chair by the dying fire while Ayanna took the bed once more. Outside, the night was crystal clear, stars brilliant in the cold sky. Both men slept peacefully, each having found something they hadn't known they were looking for. The third morning dawned clear and bright, with sunshine turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. Ayanna stood at the cabin window, fully recovered and ready to return to his people. The storm has passed completely, he observed. My tracks from 3 days ago will be gone, but I can find my way. Thomas nodded, though he felt an unexpected reluctance to see his guest leave. Your family will be relieved to see you safe. Ayanna turned from the window and held out the leather bracelet he'd been crafting. Please, accept this. Thomas took the gift reverently. The beadwork was exquisite geometric patterns in blue, white, and gold that seemed to tell a story. This is beautiful, Ayanna, really beautiful. The patterns represent the sky, the earth, and the sun that brought us together, Ayanna explained. Among my people, it means you are a trusted friend. Thomas fastened the bracelet around his wrist, deeply moved. I'll treasure it always. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Ayanna spoke again. Thomas McKenna, you have shown me that honor exists in all peoples. I will not forget this. Nor will I forget you, young friend. After a final breakfast together, Thomas helped Ayanna gather his belongings. The buckskin clothing had dried and been mended as best as possible. As they stood at the cabin door, Ayanna placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. If you ever have need, if trouble comes to your land, remember you have friends among the Lakota. And you remember you always have a place here no matter what. They shook hands firmly, then Ayanna set off across the snow-covered plains. Thomas watched until the young warrior's figure disappeared over a distant ridge, then returned to his daily routines with a heart somehow both full and empty. Hours passed quietly. Thomas worked in his barn, repaired some fence damaged by the storm, and tried not to think about how silent the cabin seemed without Ayanna's presence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he stepped outside to bring in more firewood. That's when he noticed them silent. Figures on horseback positioned along the ridgeline surrounding his property. His breath caught in his throat as he counted at least a dozen Lakota warriors, their horses still as statues against the evening sky. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas whispered as if responding to some unseen signal. The warriors began to move. But instead of approaching threateningly, they dismounted at respectful distances around his cabin. Thomas watched in amazement as each warrior placed something on the ground. A beautifully crafted arrow, a small parfleche bag, a carved bone ornament, beadwork that gleamed in the fading light. Ayanna appeared from among them, approaching Thomas with a warm smile. My father, Chief Standing Bear, sends his gratitude, as do all our people. Ayanna, but how did you? I told them of your kindness, of how you risked your own safety to save an enemy. This is not common among your people. Or mine. Ayanna gestured toward the gifts now surrounding the cabin. We honor courage and compassion wherever we find it. An older warrior, distinguished and proud, stepped forward. Despite the language barrier, his meaning was clear as he placed his hand over his heart and nodded deeply to Thomas. My father says you are now under the protection of our tribe, Ayanna translated. No harm will come to you or your animals. This land is sacred to us now because it sheltered one of our own. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes, emotions he'd kept buried since Sarah and little Jake had died. Tell your father, tell him I'm honored. More honored than I know how to say. As darkness fell completely, the warriors mounted their horses and began to fade back into the night like spirits. But the gifts remained tangible proof of an extraordinary connection forged by simple human decency. Ayanna was the last to leave. Perhaps I will visit again when the spring comes. You'd better, Thomas replied with a grin. I'll have more stories to tell by then. As the young Lakota warrior disappeared into the night, Thomas gathered the precious gifts and brought them. Inside, he placed them carefully on his mantelpiece, each one a reminder that barriers between peoples could be crossed with understanding and respect. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Thomas McKenna didn't feel alone. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang a gentler song, and somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of drums, not threatening, but welcoming, by his bedside. The wooden horse carving sat next to Iana's beadwork, two simple objects that had somehow built a bridge between worlds.